Hello, everyone. This is Wes Henson. I'm pastor of the Ridge Church, and the Ridge Church campus is located at 7350 Old Highway 13 in Carbondale, Illinois. And I want to thank you for joining me today for this week's small group Bible study for the week of August the 6th, 2023 at the Ridge Church. Now, we're in a 6-week study called Set Apart, A Life Lived for God, and today we're going to look at what it means to be set apart in the way that we think. Now, in many areas of our lives, we need to change the way we think. And that comes about as we live for Jesus. And the point of our lesson is that living for Jesus changes the way that we think. And as we follow Him, our thinking changes. It is reset to focus on Him, and we grow in our love and service to Jesus by loving and serving others. Today we're going to be in the New Testament book of Romans, and we'll be looking in chapter 12. So if you check out the links, you'll discover a printed summary along with other resources for this week's study, and then I invite you to join us on the Ridge campus Sunday morning at 9 a.m. as we go into detail. Okay, so let's begin this week's on-the-go Bible study. And we'll do that by opening our Bibles to Romans chapter 12. Now, Paul wrote this letter, the letter of Romans, to the church in Rome during his second visit to Corinth. Paul used the first 11 chapters of this letter to show his readers the wonderful plan of salvation that God has provided for all of us in Jesus Christ. And then beginning in chapter 12, Paul teaches the practical, everyday principles of how a Christian should think and speak and act. So beginning in chapter 12, we have the application of what Paul was teaching in verses 1 through 11. And this is how it begins. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, because of what I've taught you, what I've shared with you, I'm going to put it into practice. Therefore, brothers and sisters, in view of the mercies of God, I urge you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, and this is your true worship. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. Okay, so as we begin Romans chapter 12, it forces us to look backwards to Romans chapter 11, that word therefore. So in order to see what was happening in chapter 12, we look in chapters 9 through 11. And here, Paul reminded the Roman Gentile believers that the grace of God had come to them through the new covenant. Now, this new covenant, this new agreement between them and God was caused by the failure of the Jews to fulfill all the responsibilities of the old covenant or the old agreement. And so Jesus came personally to fulfill the terms of the old covenant, and he initiates a new covenant, a new agreement at the moment of his death and resurrection. So it was on this that Paul issues several challenges to the Roman believers. The old covenant has been fulfilled. The old agreement has been fulfilled. The new agreement is before you. So the believers in Rome were told not to be conformed to the present age, but to live in a way that was spiritually countercultural. In other words, they were not to go with the flow, but they were to follow the way of Jesus. Because, you see, living for Jesus changes the way we think, and therefore this leads to a renewed mind, and therefore it results in a personal transformation. Transformation, that word that Paul used in these verses, is a spiritual condition that is so radical that the Bible uses the biological term metamorphosis. That word transformation is metamorphosis. Transformation means to change form, as the caterpillar changes its form into a butterfly. So when we become a child of God, our entire perspective, our value system, our ethical standards, our morality, and our worldview begin to undergo a complete and transformational shift. And that's what God intends for us to do. And so we can be set apart with a renewed mind, verses 1 and 2 tell us. And then in these next verses, we see that we're to be set apart in the way that we think about ourselves. Let's pick up in verse 3. For by the grace given to me, I tell everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he should think. Instead, think sensibly as God has distributed a measure of faith to each one. Now, as we have many parts in one body, and all the parts do not have the same function, in the same way, we who are many are one body in Christ and individually members of one another. So Paul has challenged the Romans to devote themselves to a new level of transformational thinking and living. And then he quickly pivots to warn believers to be cautious in how they view themselves, because he knew that possessing great knowledge and having unique spiritual experiences with God could lead a person to develop a spiritual pride. And you see, pride attempts to rob God of his glory. And that's the realization behind Paul's warning here. And he reminds us that we are all of the same body. We have different parts, and we are called to give honor to the Lord and not to any one particular part. Okay, let's move on. So in the next verses, we're going to see that we are to be set apart in our love and our attitude toward others as well. We're going to skip on down to verse 9. Verse 9 says, "Let love be without hypocrisy. Detest evil. Cling to what is good. Love one another deeply as brothers and sisters. Take the lead in honoring one another. Do not lack diligence and zeal. Be fervent in the Spirit. Serve the Lord." Verse 12, "Rejoice in hope. Be patient in affliction. Be persistent in prayer. And share with the saints in their needs. And pursue hospitality." So we see that it is love that sets Christians apart in the eyes of the world. And Paul gives us several imperatives here that will help us to focus on what it means to live a sacrificial life, or a life of putting others first, or a life of loving others as God would have us to love them. And if we go down the list here, he tells us that we're to love without hypocrisy. You know, love and pretense can't exist together, and love has little to do with sentiment. It's a choice. Secondly, we are to detest evil, cling to what is good. Love isn't real if it doesn't discriminate between evil and good. Thirdly, we are to love one another deeply as brothers and sisters and take the lead in honoring each other. Fourthly, we are not to lack diligence in zeal. Instead, we're to be fervent in the Spirit and to serve the Lord. We're to rejoice in hope, to be patient in affliction, persistent in prayer. Our hope is a certain hope and assurance. It's a hope that's based on the person of Jesus Christ himself. And a rejoicing people is more likely to be a loving people, and prayer helps in this regard. Next, we are also to share with the saints in their needs and to pursue hospitality. Of course, we're to share with people far from God as well as we're able to, but God's people are the first priority. And one of the ways we do that is through our hospitality. Okay, living for Christ, and that's the point of our lesson this week. It changes the way that we think. And the truths of this lesson should make their way into our hearts so that God can transform our lives and we can be a blessing to others for God's glory. So let me share with you 3 applications, and I would invite you to consider implementing at least one of these actions this week. So one application is to recognize, assess your self-image. Evaluate whether your view of yourself is consistent with how God sees you. If you identify spiritual pride, be quick to confess it and root it out wherever it can be found. Secondly, read. Spend some time working on the transforming of your mind. We know that this is God's work, but God uses means. God uses the resources, the things that we listen to and the things that we talk about and the things that we watch. Let me give you an example here. There's a book called The Mind of Christ, written by T.W. Hunt. Well, that's a good book to maybe begin reading to help God do his work of transforming your mind. The third application, reproduce. Connect with a Christian friend to share what you have learned this week. Set an appointment and encourage that friend to share some principles from this session with another person the following week. Okay, let's wrap it all up. So living for Christ changes the way that we think. And the truths of this lesson should make their way into our daily lives so that God can transform us so that we can be a blessing for the glory of God. Okay, if you check out the links, you'll discover a printed summary along with other resources for this week's study. Then I invite you to join us on campus Sunday morning at 9 a.m. as we go into detail. All right, bye for now.